Hello everyone, welcome to World Cities 2021. My name is MICAH KOTCH. I have the privilege of moderating this amazing panel on mobility and the shifts around transportation that our cities are confronting. With me today we have ROBYN MARQUIS from NYSERDA, we have ASHWINI CHHABRA from TIER Mobility, and we have Juliet Scott-CROXFORD from Brompton Cycles. And we're going to have a conversation about the changing landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about congestion, about mass transit and some of the COVID challenges relating to how people move in cities like New York. And we're also going to talk a little bit about micromobility and changing mode shift. What I thought I would do, though, is maybe just ask the panel to talk a little bit about where they're applying most of their energy, the biggest challenge or opportunity that you are most focused on when you are not on stage for this global forum for urban innovation. And maybe, Juliet, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, MICAH. And it's great to be here, and thank you to the World City team and Resonance and Chris Fair. Juliet Scott-CROXFORD, I'm President of North America for Brompton Bicycles. And if you're not familiar with the brand, Brompton's been around since 1975 when it was invented. It's famous for its fold, so the bike folds. And really our intention is to create products that are useful and can transform people's lives as they move around cities, whether they're commuting or exploring. We recently have been working on our Brompton electric version, which also is a folding bike. We make and design the bike in London, but 75% of our production leaves the UK, and North America is a huge priority and a big market for us. So when I'm not on this stage, really my focus is on how do we expand intentionally in this market, and more immediately, how do we support people and society in New York City as we think about movement and sustainability.
Fantastic. Ash?
Yeah, it's great to be on the stage with you all in this conversation. My name is ASHWINI CHHABRA. I'm the Chief Public Policy Officer at TIER Mobility. TIER is a Berlin-based micromobility company. We offer services in shared e-scooters, e-bikes, and e-mopeds. We're currently operating across 160 cities in Europe and the Middle East. This week we just raised a Series D, so funding future growth. And you know, what do I do when I'm not on this stage? Usually having conversations with cities, helping them to envision what streets can look like if they rethink the purpose of those streets. So shifting a mindset that is that first thinks of streets as being for cars and then re-envisions them for other activities, for pedestrians, for people on bikes, for people on scooters, for people to congregate, and so forth. And so a lot of what I describe to people that I do is I tell a story about the future. Which is also a story about the past, because if you think about kind of what our streets looked like before the age of the automobile, it's very similar to where I think we should go to. So that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is having those conversations with cities, with transportation regulators, with planners, to rethink what's possible and how micromobility can play a part in that.
Excellent. ROBYN?
Great to be here with you all, thank you. ROBYN MARQUIS from NYSERDA. It's a long acronym. It's the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, so it's New York's energy office. I work on efficient mobility, and right now, when I'm not on this stage, my primary work is on the Clean Transportation Prizes. We launched them during Earth Week of this year and focused on enhancing clean mobility, electrifying transportation, and addressing air quality impacts and quality of life in New York's underserved communities. My specific focus is on our mobility management investment strategy. So I have a lot of the same conversations that you all do, but just from the government side of it. So bringing together all of those stakeholders to identify what are the key challenges that we're facing right now, who needs to be at that table, and what are the solutions to address those specific needs. So I am not all that far from this studio regularly. So I'm a walker, I'm a transit taker. I practice what I preach. So I really am looking forward to this discussion. Thanks, Micah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting mix of new companies and older companies and quasi-government agencies that are all kind of shaping this conversation about where we go in cities. And you know, from my vantage point at UrbanX, so we are an accelerator for startups who are reimagining city life. We've built this portfolio of about 70 companies over the last 5 years who are all making cities more efficient, more livable, more enjoyable, and it's also backed by MINI, which is an automaker that was started during the first gasoline crisis in the late 1950s. But it's a very interesting time, and I think a perspective where business models are changing, where there's a huge amount of innovation and new thinking and new value creation and new services that are kind of changing the city, I think, as we know it. I wanted to start with the idea that mass transit has kind of fundamentally changed post-COVID, and that in cities like New York, where arguably the subway system is really the backbone or kind of the lifeblood of the city. And you know, in full disclosure, I took the train here from Brooklyn into Manhattan today. Great experience. I had some entertainment on the train, but well worth the fare that I paid. So the fare box generally tends to make up about half of the revenue for the MTA. But meanwhile, ridership, I think day on day versus pre-pandemic levels is down about 45%. And that's about 3.2 million daily riders here in New York City. And so I think the question is, do you anticipate that some of these new behaviors will stick a year or 2 or 3 from now? And what kinds of changes are you seeing in terms of the way that transit agencies, city officials, but also you know, individuals are making in their daily commute, and how they're maybe changing their expectations around how they get from point A to point B? And I'll start with you, Robyn.
Fantastic question. I wish I had a crystal ball. I think, you know, I try not to say that this current situation, you know, has been a positive, but in terms of the mobility space, I think it really has. It's accelerated this mode shift that normally would take, you know, a decade or longer for people to reconsider their commuting patterns, their commuting behaviors, their mode choices. We're seeing a lot more people taking bikes, for example. And I think that some of that reduction in ridership is due to maybe people like myself who are teleworking. So in the mobility management space, we kind of have this 3-pronged avoid, shift, improve. So prior to this situation, asking people to avoid travel or you know, to telework, for example, or to shift to a different time of day or a different mode was a challenge to encourage that behavior or have to incentivize it. So rather than looking at it, I think, as solely maybe a loss in terms of transit ridership being down, I think it'd be interesting to get more information on where else are those people, or how else are those people traveling. So I know we're seeing increase in ridership on bikes. Other transit agencies across the state and elsewhere are kind of rethinking what it means to be a transit agency. And is that just subway and bus, or is that a more multimodal consideration for bike share, car share, et cetera? So I think, to your point of business models, both from the private sector and the public sector offerings, that maybe the 2-3 years out, we'll see, hopefully, a lot of this mode shift sticking, but perhaps working more together in multimodal trip planning.
Ash, there's clearly a glass half full case to be made, and there's a glass half empty case to be made. Do you see I mean, clearly you see the traffic, or maybe you hear the traffic in a city like New York. You think there are a lot of folks who have gotten back into their car, or who are now in their car on a much more regular basis, that are amenable to micromobility options? Or do you think that maybe the opposite is true, and as Robyn was saying, like, there's a lot of people who are finally, this has been the opportunity for them to give that up and embrace something new? Well,
I mean, I'm an optimist, and so it's actually, glass 2/3 full, given the ridership numbers. But I do think that transit is one of these things in a city like New York, in a city like Paris, in a city like London. It is one of the things that draws people to the city. So we're sitting in Times Square. People are looking forward to when the theaters are back open and you can go to a show, in the same way that we have been waiting and are thrilled when the restaurants open and you can sort of go back out and eat and you can go to bars. To me, transit feels the same way. The idea of getting on the train or getting on the bus for your daily commute, using it more regularly, is something that I miss considerably, I ache for, and I think there's a lot of people out there who kind of miss that piece of New York. So I don't know that we will go back to 10 trips a day because of telework, because of shifting patterns and how we work. But I do think that we will make fuller use of transit, and it's a glass 2/3 full. If you look at where we were 3-4 months ago on transit, it was a much more dire situation. So I'm very optimistic. As for what that means for people who've sort of shifted to cars, and are they now open to coming back to transit or trying new modes, I think that really depends on policymakers and if we pick the right policies. So just this week, Paris announced their part 2 of their Plan Vélo. So to really build out the bike network, connect it to outlying parts of the city, so that commuters can use biking as a realistic option to commute into work. London just yesterday announced the expansion of their ultra-low emissions zone. So it's now 18 times bigger as it used to be. And so if you have a polluting car, you will pay more to enter this much larger part of the city. I think that's what we need in New York. We need hard policies that are hard decisions, that will nudge people to doing the right thing. So congestion pricing is something we've been waiting on. As an optimist, I'm ever hopeful that we will get it, but much depends on policy. So if we incentivize people to get out of cars, to get into transit, if we build more bike lanes, then yes, people will try micromobility, they will try other modes, because frankly, this is not a fun city to drive a car in. And if we make it easier for people, they will choose to drive. But if you make it easier for people to bike, to take transit, to use scooters, then they will choose that as well.
Yeah, agreed. Julie, are you seeing this amongst your customer base?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Through the pandemic, we saw an extraordinary bike boom, and the growth in ridership of non-cyclists is continuing post-bike boom. So people that weren't riding are continuing to ride. I do think it will stick, and I would just say actually the hybrid model that Robyn was talking about is interesting, because with a lot of people that are riding Bromptons, they're thinking about the first and last mile of their commute. So it might not be an either or, do I use the subway or do I cycle? But actually with a Brompton, you can fold it up, you take it on the subway, you get out and you cycle the remainder of the trip. So in terms of, I mean, we're certainly seeing the demand continue, growth continue. I would say, cities weren't designed around people, despite the fact that the majority of the US population lives in urban areas. So we have to have some hard policies in place, and the things that I think the mayor in Paris have done are great examples of that actually she's really leaned into bike infrastructure and policies at the expense of motorists. And it has transformed the culture of that population and of that society. And I think we need to see more of that in New York.
Indeed.
I mean, she's committed to removing 70% of car parking, which I'm hopeful. We've got our next likely mayor in New York has committed to building 300 miles of bike lanes. So the signals are there that cities don't want to go back to business as usual coming out of COVID. What we really need to see is concrete actions coming out of that.
And in addition to that, 650 kilometers of bike lanes as well.
Yeah.
It's a super interesting opportunity for politicians who have that political capital to spend to actually institute real infrastructure changes that are going to result in higher quality of life. And yeah, I think it remains to be seen whether or not that can actually be done here in New York. There was just an article this morning that I was reading about the Fifth Avenue bus lane and some of the pushback against that from the real estate community. I'm curious as to, in the midst of this shift, how we address issues around equality and accessibility. And so, Robyn, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the focus on environmental justice communities and how you are approaching and how NYSERDA is kind of approaching this issue of accessibility and equity around transportation and particularly new zero-emission transportation technologies.
Yeah, definitely. In 2019, the Climate Act in New York was signed into law, which does have some targets for disadvantaged communities, but in particular for the prizes, that is really the sole focus of the three areas that we have. We see from early adoption on electric vehicles and some newer technologies that they tend to go toward certain demographics, while others are often left behind. So a major goal of our mobility work, even prior to the Climate Act, was thinking through how do we reach those target populations? How do they commute? What are their needs? And the reality is, as we all know, that there is no silver bullet, there is no one size fits all. So I mentioned this hybrid or multimodal approach and really introducing or increasing the access to whether it's electrified modes or bike shares or just other options for them to be able to access their essential needs. There's this, linkage between kind of economic opportunity and the transportation system, and just being able to access jobs, to access essential services, to access healthcare is a major barrier for a lot, and to do so in an affordable way. Next to housing costs, transportation is the second largest component of a household's monthly expenditures. So addressing kind of not only fair costs or access to some of these modes, but how to give them multiple options depending on what their needs are, whether it is commuting or just going around the neighborhood. Those could be different mode choices. And also not just in terms of affordability, but there's also some great research recently that's come out of NYU and others looking at the kind of gender equality issue and this concept of a pink tax, specifically in mobility. So I know people have heard that in terms of my pink razor costs more than my blue razor, for example. But in transportation, we are seeing that women, due to safety issues or disproportionately being the caregiver of the household, the current transportation system is just really not meeting their needs. There's a lack of elevators, there's a lack of general accessibility, there's a lack of lighting or someone at the station to say, hey, yeah, I had this problem. So they are instead turning to taking a ride-hailing mode or something that's viewed as not as environmentally friendly. From a biking perspective, we see lots of data on women tending to kind of be hesitant to bike unless there are dedicated bike lanes. So I think just looking at the multiple lenses, whether it's affordability, whether it's the disability community, the gender equity piece, those are all considerations in the way that we create, in particular, our funding opportunities and the priorities that we set for how we're going to spend our ratepayers' funds. It's
such a thoughtful approach, I think, and again, like an area where, as a New Yorker, there's such leadership around this approach. Like, you could have easily taken this $85 million pot of money and said, we're going to deploy, an EV fleet, an on-demand EV fleet, and just subsidize the rollout of that one initiative. But instead, you took an approach where you said, we're going to open it up to the market. We have these principles, and we're going to see what the market responds with. And I'm curious to know from your perspective, like what, what has that started to yield, but also B, like how was that decision approached or navigated internally?
Well, I can't speak too much to what that's manifested because we are currently reviewing the proposals, but I am able to say that we did see a very strong market response, and across the three, the 85 million that you mentioned was a series of 3 parallel prize competitions, each with their own slight different focus area. But the decision, I think, was an easy one. It's not only something that's there in the Climate Act or in the emphasis in the regulatory order where this money came from, but just the right decision to make, and how we've been prioritizing our spending even prior to there being this statewide mandate. I think if we have a transportation system that doesn't work for some, then that doesn't work for anybody. So thinking through how to solve the problem for them kind of backs into this spillover benefit for it being a system that works for everybody. So I think it was as I said, a pretty easy decision to make.
Awesome. That's great. Ash, when you think about this issue of equity, accessibility, I'm sure it comes up in some of the conversations that you have with agency heads. How are they approaching it? How is TIER responding to that issue?
I mean, it's central to the conversations, right? So TIER at root is a first and last mile service. I think any of our services are, whether it's ride sharing, micromobility, we don't exist without mass transit in the big cities where we operate. And so it really is about how do we complement that. And that's also, that dovetails nicely with the question of who are you serving and are you doing that equitably? So transit systems are set up often in a sort of hub and spoke model. This is where people live, this is where people work, and these are the 2 modes that you want to connect. Cities have then grown up around those networks. And so you may live near a transit hub, but there are a lot of people who don't. You have to take a bus to catch your train to come into Midtown to work. And so services like TIER's help bridge that gap for a lot of people. It turns your hour-and-a-half commute into the city center into a 45-minute commute because you can shift some of those bus trips into a micromobility trip or into a rideshare trip. And so in many ways, you put transit within the reach of more people who otherwise can't afford to live near transit. And if you think about it that way, your interests are very much aligned with those of transit planners. And what we found is in the large cities where we operate, where there's a robust transit network, somewhere between 25 to 40% of our trips are first or last mile trips. So very much our success is tied to the success of the transit network, vice versa. As for focus on equity, I think that's something that cities increasingly demand their micromobility providers will fulfill. If you want to use the public right-of-way, you have to serve all of the city. So it's not just touristy areas, it's not just the central business district, it's going to be outlying areas, and we want pricing that reflects that. I think this is something that, so New York launched a scooter pilot earlier this year. New York is actually pretty much at the vanguard of this. If you think about where it's situated, it's in the Bronx, it's in the East Bronx. They could have put it in downtown Brooklyn, they could have put it in a number of places. It's a trial, and so they'll trial it out there and then hopefully it'll expand elsewhere. But I think it was first and foremost in the city's mind that this program be done in a way and in a place where it was going to serve a population that currently doesn't have other micromobility modes. So City Bike is not available in the East Bronx. So,
but the success is somewhat predicated on density, right? It'd be very difficult to do if the East Bronx was more sprawled. Or
it really is, and I think a full-fledged system, the type that we see in Paris, the type that we see in Berlin, does cover the entire city because that's how people move. People don't move within their boroughs only. They don't move only in a hub and spoke pattern. This is interesting. I mean, Robyn mentioned the research from NYU. This is Sarah Kaufman's work at the Rudin Center. male travel patterns historically were home to downtown, win the bread, come home kind of thing. And you see that that doesn't map against how women and frankly, modern workers of all sexes move around their city. And so how do you serve those spoke-to-spoke trips? How do you serve late night trips when in some cities transit may shut down at a certain time? So filling in the gaps is what sharing services do really well because they're fluid.
Yeah.
And so figuring out a way that you can structure your policies that those are requirements is something that I think policymakers need to think actively about.
I mean, I think it's so critical because there's so many underserved communities, and I was in LA recently where they don't have access to transport, and it's a huge barrier to things like access to employment and access to healthcare. So it really does need a thoughtful approach around how we ensure we can broaden our outreach to those underserved communities. And just on the diversity and inclusion piece, I think the bike industry has traditionally been a very white and male industry, but that there is quite a significant cross-industry push to broaden out the diversity of that industry. And we're certainly seeing an increase in women and people of colour riding and riding Bromptons as well, I think, because of its portability, because of its weight. And I think it's certainly for us, it's a huge priority.
Yeah, fantastic, as it should be. We have just a couple of minutes left.
I would just add, safety underpins that, right? Yeah. I mean, what we learn from riders is more women would ride if there were more safe places to ride, if the bike lane network were protected, if it were continuous. And so there's a need to sort of build the product, whether that's the private sector product or the public sector product, so that it's more inviting to more people. And that's something that adding bike lanes, building sort of the second generation and third generation of vehicles, I think helps us do. But you kind of need to move both levers.
And collaborate. I think the public and private collaboration is so critical. I see Robyn nodding. But it needs both. It needs all of those things, I think, to move us forward. Agreed.
In our brief remaining time, I want to talk about the rise of e-bikes, which, according to data that I saw from NPD, grew 240% in the 12 months leading up to July of 2021. But my personal background and interest is in distributed energy solutions and in particular community scale microgrids. And I'm very curious about the growth of energy storage and the growth of light electric vehicles and how you think about the evolution of e-bikes and also other form factors. And ways not only that we will power or the design of those systems, whether those are swappable batteries or what have you, but also ways to be able to use fleets for grid flexibility and ultimately incorporating more renewables into the grid. And just a really interesting stat. So I think the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is called IRENA, said that by 2050, we might see about 9 terawatts of stationary storage versus like 50 terawatts of portable storage, essentially storage on wheels, right? And so the growth of that, of thinking about, the battery on wheels as a grid resource is something that I think a lot of the public maybe has seen with the growth of the wait list for the Ford F-150, but certainly we're seeing it with light electric vehicles, e-bikes, and other form factors. So just really curious how you all are thinking about it, if you are at all.
Definitely thinking about it. The e-bike growth is not going away. It's accelerating. It's a hugely fragmented market. The Brompton Electric, we're seeing, we're capturing a new market of riders. The ability to assist on riding means people are tending to use it for longer journeys as well. And interestingly, being on the West Coast, I also saw a difference in, obviously there's the electric scooters everywhere, But the trend isn't going away. And whilst I think Asia and Europe have been leading on this, we're certainly catching up.
True. Ash?
Yeah, I mean, we're making a big, bold bet on distributed electric. So we have the Tier Energy Network. We have kiosks in shops where riders can go in and swap the batteries. And so there are the nodes across the cities that are going to have batteries located there. You can see that one day being a larger part of the business than actually moving people around. So the potential there is massive. And I think it's a great way also for cities to think about how they want to deal with this when it comes to cars as well. Starting with the smaller vehicles in a compact way, in a more dynamic swapping way, I think really opens your eyes to what policies do we now need in place to do this with cars.
Robyn, last word on this.
I think it's safe to say that the energy agency of the state is definitely looking at this. And what I'm really interested in seeing is the comparative analysis of, you guys mentioned battery swapping versus the current methods of rebalancing systems. So if anyone's been in the city, while there's a truck going by full of city bikes because there's more demand in one location and less supply, that actually does have quite an environmental toll as well. So I'm very curious to see what comes out of the prizes. One of them focuses specifically on medium and heavy duty vehicles and their potential impacts to the grid, how they charge, and the other considerations that you mentioned. So yes, we're thinking about it very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your insights and your candor and all the work that you're doing. And to everyone out there on video, I wish you a great rest of the conference. Enjoy. Thank you for your leadership and hard work in making our cities more efficient, livable, and lovable. Have a great rest of the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.